Hey there, AP Psych friends. Guess what? I am super excited because today we are continuing with Unit 9, which is Social Psychology. And honestly, it is my absolute favorite unit in all of psychology, definitely saving the best for last. So let's go ahead and get started with our two modules we are covering today. And guess what again? These are my two favorite modules of all of this unit. So you're going to hear that a lot, this unit of this is my favorite, because it's literally all my favorite. I love it. But for real, these two modules, I think they're the best. So this first one, module 75, is talking about conformity and obedience. And then the next module we'll do, module 76, is about group dynamics and group behavior and everything. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Make sure you got your Unit 9 slide decks open and you can be filling information in as we go through. So to start us off here, we got to cover what are norms, because norms are very important when we are thinking about our interactions with other people. Norms kind of prescribe our proper behavior. They are understood rules for accepted and expected behavior. So, like what's the norm for a teacher's behavior? What's the norm for a student's behavior? Who out of the two is the norm more likely to have raising their hand? That's probably more the norm we've established for students. So those are just that's a quick example for what a norm is. You can think about that in lots of different situations, even things like too of if you're someone who, well, this isn't necessarily true of all religions, but if you're someone who is religious, maybe there's the norm of when you go to your religious establishment, you're not talking just to like random people all the time, like you're listening and you're there and you're part of the experience, things like that. Or maybe the norm is that you do talk a lot or you're singing along and everything. So just what's the expected behavior in certain situations. Next, we have a concept called social contagion. And if you think about it, fish swim in schools, birds fly in flocks. Humans also tend to go with their group, and we think what the group thinks and do what the group does. That is because behavior is contagious. So think of what's the thing that happens in your brain that kind of triggers if someone else yawns, you'll probably yawn too. Or also if someone else is like scratching their arm and you're just kind of paying attention, you might start doing that too. What's the thing in your brain that makes you do that? Yep, that's it. Mirror neurons. So they're the thing that in your brain, they are kind of firing as if you were doing the thing yourself, just when you're observing someone else. And so then that kind of like makes you do that action too. So different behaviors are all contagious. So one example of this is they did a study where, exactly as I was explaining, some people in the room would be doing things like rubbing their arm or like shaking their foot, rubbing their face, anything like that. And they found that most people in that experiment tended to do the same thing as whoever the person that was in on the experiment was doing. So they called this the chameleon effect. Chameleons just kind of like blend in with our surroundings and everything. So that's kind of you doing the same thing. If someone else does something, you kind of follow that too. That's social contagion. How can it lead to empathy and fondness? This natural mimicry enables us to empathize, which means to feel what others are feeling, because you're kind of experiencing the same thing yourself sometimes too. So perhaps you've noticed that when someone nods their head as you do and echoes your words, you feel a certain rapport and liking. That is because empathy is being sparked, where you kind of have this shared experience of something. So what about laughter? Is that contagious? Yes, laughter is definitely one of our contagious things, which is a very good kind of contagion to have. And so keep that in mind, that if you start laughing, you can make other people laugh too. You might remember this Chewbacca mom video that became viral from Facebook Live before in 2016. There's a link to the video here if you click on it, if you want to take a look at it. And I think it's actually going to be brought up real quick. Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Give me 1 second, get back to my screen here. There we go. Okay, so feel free to click on that if you want. You can watch the video. It is very funny, totally random, very lighthearted, but she just starts laughing and she can't stop. And then you might find as you're watching it that you kind of start laughing along with her. Not necessarily because you find it as funny as she does, but just because her laughter is so great and might make you laugh along as well. How does social networking enable social contagion? So social networks serve as contagious pathways for moods like happiness and loneliness, also things like drug use, and even behavior patterns that lead to obesity and sleep loss. On websites, positive ratings generate more positive ratings, a phenomenon called positive herding. What about through Facebook? Facebook did this experiment where 61 million people were sent a message that encouraged voting with a link to a local voting place and a clickable I voted button. For some recipients, the message also contained pictures of Facebook friends who had already voted as well. They found that those who received the tell your friends you voted messages were slightly more likely to vote, and that difference generated an estimated 282,000 additional votes. So knowing what others are doing and feeling what they are feeling may impact what we do and feel as well. So again, just lots of ways that behavior can definitely be contagious. And kind of on that note of following along with what other people are doing, we have this idea of conformity. Conformity is adjusting our behavior or thinking to coincide with a group standard because of real or imagined pressure to fit in. Basically, there's just some kind of pressure that makes you feel like I should be doing what these people are doing too. I don't want to stand out and be different in any way. You can try this on your own real quick. Let's look at this. Here is a line. This is the one you're using as like your standard line. Then we got 3 other ones over here. Which of these 3 comparison lines do you think is the closest in height to this first line here? Think about that, judge it for yourself. That is the basis for one experiment that was done by Solomon Asch. And as I mentioned, this was one of my favorite experiments ever. I literally just love this experiment. It's super simple, but I just think it's amazing. So this was called the Asch line test or Asch line experiment that was conducted by Solomon Asch. So what happened here is the subject of the study, the person who was like the participant, is given that line test, and then their scores are recorded of did they get the answer correct of this is the one that matches that original line. Then that person is asked to join 5 other men in a room to complete that line test at the same time as all of them. Here's the kicker though, the 5 other men in that room are all Confederates. Think to yourself real quick, what does that mean? Confederates are people who are part of the research study, so they're in on it. They are people who are intentionally acting a specific way for the results of the study, or sorry, for the sake of the study. So those 5 other people were going to all act a certain way, but only one of them was the real participant being studied, but that person doesn't know that all the other people are in on it. So a little bit more about what happened. In order around the table, the men are asked for their answers to the line test, and the first few trials, each answers correctly, as does the subject. So they all are giving the correct answer, and then the person in the study is also giving the correct answer because it's kind of simple test. On the 3rd trial, though, the Confederates begin answering incorrectly. Asch is looking to see whether or not the subject will begin answering incorrectly as well. So what's he going to do? Is he going to conform when everyone else is giving the wrong answer? Yes or no? And we are definitely going to watch a clip of this experiment in class because it's really funny to just kind of watch exactly what happens here. But what ended up happening is that college students, when answering the questions alone, erred less than 1% of the time, meaning that they were almost every single time correct. But what happened when several others, those Confederates, answered incorrectly? More than 1/3 of the time, so more than like 33% of the time, these intelligent and well-meaning college students were willing to call white black by going along with the group, meaning they knew something was wrong, but they went with it anyways because everyone else in the group was doing it. So the result from this study was that more than 30% of the time, the people in the study went along with the incorrect answer. They conformed to the group just because they wanted to kind of fit in. There was some kind of social pressure of like, okay, like everyone else is saying this, I must be missing something. I at least don't want to be the odd one out here. I'm just going to go with what they're saying, even though they were pretty certain that was probably incorrect. So why exactly do humans conform? Why do we so often think as others think and do as they do? Why, when asked controversial questions, are college students' answers more similar when they raise their hands and more diverse when they use anonymous electronic clickers? Think to yourself, does that happen for you too? If you're required to say something out loud, do you have different responses than, especially in this virtual world, if you like share a private message in the chat or something like that? I personally feel like I've seen a huge difference in this school year of more students voicing their opinions, but they prefer to do it privately, versus people sharing things in the public chat or out loud. So why do we clap when others clap, eat as others eat, believe what others believe, say what others say, see what others see? That's all because of this idea of conformity. So like I said, that was a super simple study, but I just think that it proves so much that is true about our society and people and everything and our behavior that I just love it. And like I said, kind of watching the experiment itself is a little fun too. So we'll definitely do that in class. All right, let's pause here. Which of the following here is an example of conformity? Pause it real quick so that you can read through each one. But I'm going to go ahead and share that the correct answer is letter B. Renee buys the same brand of sweatshirt that most of the kids in her school are wearing. She just wants to fit in like everyone else. Okay, so now we've got two different kinds of social influence. One is called normative social influence. That is an influence resulting from a person's desire to gain approval or avoid disapproval. So again, it's kind of more of that, I want to fit in some way. I want other people to like me, or I want to make sure people don't dislike me and everything. So we conform to avoid rejection or to gain social approval. That is called normative social influence. Look at the word norm in normative. That means you want to go with the norm and make sure you can fit in and everything. And remember that we have a need for belonging. Think back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We definitely have a need to belong and fit in with other people. So it's really important to us as humans to make sure that we fit in with other people. The other kind of social influence we have is called informational social influence. That is influence resulting from one's willingness to accept others' opinions about reality. So when we accept others' opinions about reality, as when reading online movie and restaurant reviews, we are responding to informational social influence. So you're not going with it because you want to fit in, but it's more like, yes, I agree with the information that's presented here. You want to be right. You want to go along with something that you think is right. So if people are saying like, this restaurant is the best, you absolutely need to go there, you might go along with it, not because like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid what people will say if I don't go, but instead because like, oh, okay, all these people must be right. So I'm going to take that information they gave me and use it. And I'm going to go do the same thing and go to that restaurant. So practice here. Despite her mother's pleas to use a more ergonomic backpack, Antonia insists on trying to carry all of her books to school in an oversized purse the way her fashionable friends all seem to do. She's affected by what type of social influence? Is it normative social influence or informational social influence? That's correct. It is normative social influence. She's going with the flow, wants to fit in with what the norm is. Has nothing to do with what makes the most sense informationally. Okay, guess what? We're at my second, not that it's my second favorite, we're at another one of my favorite studies of all time. And this one is called the Milgram experiment, conducted by Stanley Milgram. It may be something you have possibly heard before. It's a very, very famous study. I want to make a disclaimer with this that even though I say it's my favorite, I say that because, again, it's interesting what we learn from it. However, it is not one of those super ethical studies and everything. So I'm not at all saying that I support the behaviors that were done, but instead, I just think that the outcome of it was very interesting for us to have gained as knowledge. But what happened was Stanley Milgram was a social psychologist, and get this, fun fact, he was a high school classmate of Philip Zimbardo. How have you heard that name recently? That was because in the last module, we talked about the Stanford prison experiment that Philip Zimbardo conducted. Hint, hint, that is my also favorite study of all time. All three of these studies, all in social psych, are my favorite studies. That's another one that wasn't super ethical, but again, very interesting outcome. So anyways, Milgram was classmates with Zimbardo, and then he was also a student of Solomon Asch from the Asch line test we just talked about. So all these people, crazy world, how they're all connected. So anyways, Milgram knew that people often give in to social pressures, but what about outright commands? So not just like, oh, I want to fit in with other people, I want to look like them and everything, but what if someone is specifically telling you to do something? Are you going to listen to it? So he wondered whether or not people would obey commands. So his experiment was all about obedience. Solomon Asch was all about conformity. Are people going to conform with these pressures here? Stanley Milgram was focused on obedience. Will people comply with certain commands, even if they don't feel comfortable with it? So he was definitely very motivated with this study by everything that happened with the concentration camps in Germany. So he was really wanted to understand why Nazi soldiers followed orders to kill millions of Jewish people in the Holocaust, because it kind of brings up this idea of, is there just true evil in the world, or is there some kind of motivating factor where good people end up doing bad things? So that's kind of really what he wanted to see. And you can see one of the people who were part of the Nazi soldiers said, I was only following orders. So that's kind of an example of, he's saying like, it wasn't my fault, it wasn't my idea or anything, but I was just doing what I was told to do, even though it might not have been okay. So that was definitely a big influence of why Milgram was like, well, we got to explore that a little more, because how did that happen? So between the years of 1963 to 74, Milgram conducted over 20 replications and trials of his now famous obedience study. I am just kind of going to read through these slides here because I do explain it pretty well. So more than 1,000 people participated over the course of the elaborately long designed study. The surface story was simple. There were people who were learners in the study, and they would attempt to remember a series of paired words. The teachers in the study would provide electric shocks to the learners when they incorrectly matched the pairs. So all the people in this study were probably under the impression that this had something to do with it being a memory test, which of course is not at all what it was about, but you want to make sure that you're not giving stuff away. So they definitely needed to make sure that they debriefed people afterwards. So this is the shock generator here. So he carefully walked the teacher through the details of the shock generator, even giving the teacher a small sample shock. So they know, like, look, this thing's real here. It gives shocks. Then the learner is hooked up to that shock machine, and they made sure to show the teacher that the learner in the adjacent room would be connected to the shock generator. But here's the kicker. That electric shock generator was actually fake. The one that they were using on those students, that one was fake. And it had shock levels depicted all the way up to 450 millivolts, or XXX is how they had it listed there. That was fake. Really important to understand, no electric shock was ever given to the learner at any point in the course of this study. So there was never, ever, ever actually a real shock that was given to the learner. But here's the second kicker too. The learner was actually a Confederate. Again, we just talked about that word. So that means they were in on the study. They were someone who was like an actor paid to be going along with what they told them to do in the study. The learner, again, never received any electric shock, and they were paid to just have certain behaviors as if they were actually getting shocked, but they weren't. So what was the real purpose of his study then? That was all to let the teacher be the real subject of the experiment. They wanted them to believe that he or she was administering shock to the learner for incorrect answers. In reality, he was researching just how far the subject would go in administering electric shock, because he or she had been told to do so by an authority figure. So it's not like people are just twisted and, yes, I want to inflict pain on someone else, but instead he wanted to see, when someone's specifically telling you you've got to shock them, they got it incorrect, are people going to go along with it? So the only person who was not in on the study, the only person who was the participant, was the person that was called the teacher, the one administering the fake shock, but they didn't know it was fake. So what do people think about how this would go? Before doing the experiments, he asked people who were not in the study, non-participants, what they would do in that situation. Of, would you give the shock or would you not? Most people were sure that they would stop soon after the learner first indicated pain, saying like, like that shock really hurts and everything. Definitely saying they would stop before the person shrieked in agony. 40 psychiatrists also agreed with that prediction. But that was not really what happened. When Milgram conducted the experiment with other men aged 20 to 50, he found that more than 60% complied fully. That means they went all the way up to the highest voltage of shock, which was labeled XXX, which, you know, like that in itself means like, this is really, really bad. You don't know what's going to happen when this person gets shocked with that. When he ran a new study with 40 new teachers and a learner who complained of having a slight heart condition, the results were still similar. So there were definitely a bunch of variations to the study that I'll mention in a couple moments, but that was one of them, of the person who was getting shocked saying like, hey, I've got like a heart condition, you got to stop and everything. They still found that more than 60% complied fully. A full 65% of the new teachers in his later trial obeyed the experimenter right up to the 450 volts, the very, very end there. So think about that number there. In his study on obedience, approximately what percentage of people delivered what they believed to be the maximum shock level? So that number was 60% or like 65, depending on which study. So that's all right around 2/3. 2/3 is like 66%. So that is our answer there. About 2/3 of people complied. Well, more than half for sure. So what were some of the variations on the initial research design? Like I said, that wasn't the only version they did of it. In one trial, the learner was seated right next to the teacher, and the teacher had to lift the learner's arm to place it on a shock plate. So in that one, obviously they wanted to see like, what does proximity do? And like, when I can actually see this person and I have to inflict the pain on them right there, how would that make a difference? They found that obedience was the highest in these conditions here. When the person giving the orders was close at hand, so the person saying like, you've got to shock them, you've got to shock them, when they were really close by the teacher, the person giving the shocks, they were more likely to comply, especially when that person had a white lab coat on. So it just kind of gave them this aura of authority and everything. They obeyed more when the authority figure was supported by a prestigious institution. So conducting the study on the Yale campus versus downtown Bridgeport increased obedience. Obedience was highest when the victim was depersonalized or at a distance, even in another room. So if you can't see the person and everything, or you see them but you're not close to them, that makes you more likely to do it. And when there were no role models for defiance. So there was no one else in the room saying like, no, like I'm not going to do this, or hey, you shouldn't do that. Everyone was telling them, yeah, you need to do this. So why was that one not super ethical? Because the people who were administering the shocks, what they thought was real, they were under so much psychological distress there. They thought that they were actually harming people. And so it is kind of interesting to see the fact that people are willing to comply. But let me make it very clear, they were not all just like, yeah, sure, like let's keep shocking. If you watch videos of it, hopefully we can share that in class too, the participants in the study, they're like in agony as they're like, I'm so sorry to do this to you. But then they press the shock button because they think it's like their only choice just because someone tells them they have to. So that definitely caused a lot of psychological stress for people during. And then after too, to think about the fact that like, okay, thank goodness I wasn't actually hurting someone, but that means I was willing to. Think about what kind of effect that can have on you and your psychological well-being. So again, not a very ethical study, did show us a lot of really important and interesting information about social behavior, but that study in that sort of way definitely could not be done anymore today. So as we mentioned here though, which all happen to be my three most favorite, these three famous research studies in psychology were all done by social psychologists, and that is Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Study, Solomon Asch's line test study, and Stanley Milgram's obedience study here. So those are three super important ones. You definitely make sure you know the difference between all of them. Philip Zimbardo, it's interesting, he at a lecture in Stanford in 2010 said, all evil begins with 15 volts, kind of referencing Milgram's experiment there. So in any society, great evils often grow out of people's compliance with lesser evils. Think about something that you learned again last module. What does that sound like when you start with something small, you agree to that, then you're more likely to agree to something bigger later on? That's the foot in the door technique. People started with the 15 volts and then were able to go up again and again. If he had said from the start, give them the highest shock, people were probably way less likely to do it. So again, this just comments on the idea of, are people actually evil, or are there just situations that lead people to engage in evil behaviors? I do have to say, by the way, that there's a course at University of Maryland where I went to school, and I'm sure they have it at other schools too, called The Psychology of Evil. It was a special course that was offered, so I was never able to get into it. But if you have the chance to do so, I'm sure it must be a very fascinating course if you ever want to partake in something like that. So just kind of throwing that out there. There's definitely cool classes around this stuff. I took Psychology of Happiness instead, which was equally awesome and definitely probably more uplifting. But it would be really interesting to study that a little bit more. So how does the situation impact the expression of evil? Ordinary students may follow orders to haze initiates into their group. Think of sororities and fraternities, how there's hazing behavior. Ordinary employees may follow orders to produce and market harmful products, and ordinary soldiers may follow orders to punish and then torture prisoners. So again, that's the whole, is it more nurture then, or is it nature? It's inherent within us. Some people do resist. It's important to note that when feeling pressured, some react by doing the opposite of what's expected. The power of one or two individuals to sway majorities is called minority influence. You are swayed by the smaller group of people. Such as this example here, everyone else has their arm raised, but this one person has his arms folded, kind of being defiant here in this situation. It's definitely hard to be the one to stand out and be different. So what did social psychologists learn? They learned that social control is the power of the situation and personal control is the power of the individual. Those things definitely interact. So rotten situations turn some people into bad apples, like Philip Zimbardo demonstrated in the Stanford prison study, where, by the way, he was part of the study himself too. He became the supervisor of the whole fake prison and everything, and he even got carried away in it too and started kind of doing some bad things. So no one's immune to these different behaviors that could end up happening. But also some people do resist and they end up becoming heroes too. All right, so that was module 75. That one was a little bit longer, so we can go a little quicker through module 76 here now. This one is about group behavior. Again, super, super fascinating. Just love this stuff. I think it is all so cool. And for this entire unit, one reason I love it so much is because it is so applicable to our own lives. You can see with your interactions with other people where all these things come into play, and you probably have a lot of personal examples you can pull from with this unit. So that's why I love it so much. All right, so one thing with group behavior is this thing called social facilitation, and that is when you have improved performance on simple or well-learned tasks in the presence of others. So basically something that you know very well or something that's a really easy task, you'll do better at it when there's people watching you. I know it's interesting because you might think oh, you usually feel a little more pressure and get scared and everything, might get nervous. But if it's something you know well or it's something that's kind of easy and there's low stakes, that little bit of pressure from other people actually makes you perform better. It makes you a little more alert and ready to go and everything. So that's why skilled athletes often find that they are on when there's an audience around them as opposed to when they're just practicing by themselves or something. So they do even better when people are watching. And that is true for the fact that if it's something you're good at, you'll probably do even better with it. But that's also true of the opposite as well, of if it's something you are not so good at or it's a really hard task, you are probably going to do even worse if people are with you. So social facilitation is basically an amplified performance of however you would do on your own with something. If you usually do well, you'll do even better. If you usually do pretty poorly by yourself, you'll do even worse when other people are around. Here's an example. Expert pool players who made 71% of their shots when alone made 80% when 4 people came to watch them. So that was a good example there. But poor shooters of pool made 36% of their shots when alone, made only 25% when watched. I'm going to skip that one here. All right, so Maggie's an excellent hockey player. She's playing in the final hockey game of her high school career. The cheering of the fans causes her to score 3 goals in the game, a record for her. She's just really feeling this vibe right now. The most likely explanation for her performance is which of these options here? That's it. Letter C, social facilitation. Next term here, social loafing. This one is definitely something I'm sure we can all recognize some behavior with. So social loafing is the tendency for people in a group to exert less effort when pulling their efforts towards attaining a common goal than when individually accountable. That's a really wordy way to say that people tend to not give as much and participate as much if there's other people in the group versus if you are responsible for doing something by yourself. If it's just you, you're like, oh, it all falls on me, I gotta get it done. If there's 3 other people in the group, you're like, oh, cool, I barely have to do anything here. So in group projects, that's probably an example where I'm sure you have seen this happen, whether maybe it was you or it was other people in the group who were participating in social loafing, which was when some people are putting in all the work and other people are like, they got this, I'm gonna let them work there. What causes social loafing in a group setting? Members feel less accountable because, like I said, there's less responsibility amongst all the people, and they worry less about what others think. They may view their individual contributions as dispensable. Members may overestimate their own contributions, downplaying others' actions, and they may slack off if they share equally in the benefits, regardless of how much they contribute. So there's lots of different reasons of why this kind of happens. And it's not like you consciously think about like, I'm not going to do as much, but it might just sort of subconsciously happen. Okay, what's de-individuation? That is the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint occurring in group situations that foster arousal and anonymity. Basically, it means you lose your sense of self when you're in some kind of high energy group for some sort of reason, and especially if you're not easily identifiable by other people. One example I really like to use with this is think about the internet and comments and everything like that. You know how dangerous the comment section can be on whatever articles, videos, anything like that, posts that you have, because people get so amped up about it. It just brings up a lot of energy. You might get really hyped up about whatever the topic is, and you're somewhat anonymous on the internet. Sometimes literally your name isn't even out there. Other times your name is there, but you're not face to face saying it to a person. You don't see the impact on them when you say those things. So that can kind of lead to this de-individuation, a loss of your sense of self, where you might not have said that to someone's face in person, but you can hide behind your screen here and like, I'm not me anymore. No one's really pinning this on me. I can say what I want to say here, even though it's probably not very nice. So please be careful of that for yourselves and consider that when you read things from other people that are just super not nice. It's just something that you kind of lose your sense of self. Not at all saying it's okay, but just kind of finding a way to protect yourself from it. This happens a lot with like riots, either for a bad reason that people get worked up and are rioting, or for a good reason. Like one example too is I think it was maybe University of Maryland won a basketball game several years ago, like a championship, and it was a huge deal. People were so excited. They were storming the court, but then they were also like storming the streets and everything. And things got so out of control. And it was just because they were all so happy and amped up about it. But again, they're in this huge group. They lose their sense of selves. They're kind of anonymous. So they act in these behaviors. But the interesting thing is too, some of the people in those situations express bewilderment over their own behavior. They're like, I cannot believe I did something like that. That's not me. So that is a very dangerous thing to think about with de-individuation. But here's the good news. It can also result in pro-social actions. So sometimes de-individuation is a good thing. The releasing of self-restraint may allow an individual to dance like no one is watching, sing with the crowd, or attempt to express themselves in a way they may not if not in the crowd. So, you know, it can be good to feel a little anonymous sometimes when it makes you just let loose a little bit more and be your true self. Okay, a couple more terms here. The next one is group polarization. And that is the enhancement of a group's prevailing inclinations through discussion within the group. Meaning you already kind of have an opinion about something. And I just like to, in my mind, kind of overgeneralize here just so I can remember it a little more easily. So basically, I like to think of someone who's on the extreme of something of this thing is really, really horrible. Like this thing is the worst. Then when you're in a group with other people who have that same belief, this thing is the worst, you tend to go even further with that, where you're all like, yes, this is the absolute worst. And all together, you have that same feeling. The same can happen on the other side too. If you all think this thing is really, really awesome, we love this. And so we can see that this happens. It can be a good thing, like I said, when low prejudice students become even more accepting while discussing racial issues if they're with other low prejudice students. So their whole mentality becomes even stronger of, yes, like prejudice is a really, really bad thing, and we can have this open discussion here and a healthy discussion of racial issues. Unfortunately, on the flip side too, there's an increase in prejudice in a high prejudice group of students who were discussing things as well. So group polarization, I like to think of it as like like the two poles of something, one extreme on this way, one extreme the other, you might be kind of just like, yeah, this thing's not the best, or like, yeah, this thing's okay. But then with a group, you go even further towards that extreme with your group who has the same belief. All right. The internet definitely kind of supports group polarization happening a lot. You can read through that a little bit on your own there. Next one is group think. Make sure you don't get this confused with group polarization. Group think is the mode of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in a decision-making group overrides a realistic appraisal of alternatives. So essentially with group think, it's I want to make sure we can have a consensus here in the group that even though I think maybe this isn't the best thing, I'm just going to go with it for the sake of having harmony with the group here. And that can lead to some really bad results when it means people aren't actually thinking through stuff as well as they should be and proposing alternatives and everything, because you just want to go with that collective mentality there, basically. So group think, it's like kind of like a hive mind thing. It's everyone having the same thought and agreeing on something. Not the same as group polarization, which is when you already have a belief and then it gets even stronger with the group. Group think is, I want to maintain harmony with this group, so I'm just going to go along with what they're saying, even if you might not agree with it. This happened with the Bay of Pigs, that fiasco, if you remember that from your history classes with JFK. And so basically there were these invaders who were supposed to go to Cuba. They were easily captured and quickly linked to the US government. So then Kennedy was wondering, how could I have been so stupid and let this happen? What they discovered is that there was the soaring morale of the recently elected president, JFK, and his advisors. Everyone was all really excited having him, that it kind of gave them this false sense of confidence. And they took it a little too far there, didn't have enough people who spoke up and said, like, we need to think about this a little better. Everyone, since no one spoke strongly against the idea, everyone assumed the support was unanimous. So that's an example of groupthink. Another example I was thinking of is, think about juries and how you have to have a unanimous decision. All 12 jurors must agree. I wonder how often that must happen, that you go with this groupthink mentality of like, okay, everyone else says this person's not guilty or this person is guilty, that maybe like I'm just going to go with it too because we have to have a consensus here, even though I don't necessarily think it's right. So that might be another example where groupthink happens. All right, next question. Marie disagrees with the idea her group is coming up with and initially tries to voice her concerns. After the initial try, she doesn't voice her own concerns any longer because she does not want to go against the group. So she's being affected by which thing here? That is letter B, groupthink, the one that we just discussed there. She wants consensus. Last term here, we're almost done, is culture, and it's one that's pretty straightforward. I'm sure you're very familiar with it. Culture is the enduring behaviors, ideas, attitudes, values, and traditions shared by a group of people and transmitted from one generation to the next. So it has to do with things like, what are you eating at your dinner table? What are the different activities you do together? Time of day that you are eating to, what kind of just values do you have with other people? What kind of clothes do you wear? The language that you speak, the different body language you have also, of is it okay to touch someone and like shake hands, or is eye contact bad or good, those kinds of things. That all comes together to make up culture. And I'm sure you can spend a little time identifying your own culture. Culture shock is kind of what happens when your sense of culture and what you know does not match up with another culture that you are thrown into for one reason or another. So for example, I've never been outside the country and I'm really excited to be able to do that one day when it's safe to be traveling again. But I'm sure that I will probably experience a little culture shock wherever I go, because I'm very used to my own culture and everything. And I really want to be able to branch out, but I'm sure it'll be a little bit of, oh, this is also different from me. I'm experiencing all these new things here, which can be a good thing, but like, I don't know how to act in this situation. I don't know what the norms are here in this other culture. So that's kind of what happens with culture shock. Also, culture varies over time. I'm sure that you have seen this, how things have changed. Like, for example, since the 60s, most Western cultures have changed with astonishing speed. We have so much more technology now, which influences things. I guarantee you my grandparents were not worrying about social media when they were growing up and everything. We also have middle-class people enjoying the convenience of air-conditioned housing, online shopping, anywhere, anytime electronic communication, all of these things. And a really good thing, though, is many people now enjoy expanded human rights. So even within your own culture, it definitely might vary over time as we have different things going on in our world and new developments and everything. All right, folks, that is it. I hope that you enjoyed these two modules as much as I enjoy telling you about them. Literally, I just love them so much. I'll say it one more time. They're my favorite, and this is my favorite unit. Hope you all enjoyed. Take note of these things in your own daily lives and try to do a little observation and see how they play into your daily interactions with people. We will see you guys in class. Take care. Have a good one. See you later.